Professor Nye is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Academy of Diplomacy, and a member of the Executive Committee on the Trilateral Commission. He served as director of the Aspen Strategy Group, director of the Institute for East-West Security Studies, director of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, the American representative on the United Nations Advisory Committee on Disarmament Affairs, and has been a member of the Advisory Committee on the Institute of International Economics. As you can imagine, it is not common for us to have a scholar and a professional of such great distinction. Please join me today in welcoming Joseph S. Nye, Jr.
Thank you very much, Corey. And let me tell you, it's a pleasure to be here at BYU. I've a number of good friends and colleagues who are graduates, and now I can go back and tell them I've been there. What I'd like to talk to you about today is the problems of leadership and how to think about leadership. And to tell you about this little book, I wrote this book because I was teaching a course on leadership after I stepped down of being dean at the Kennedy School at Harvard. And I was looking for a book that was short and readable. And there are lots of short books that were cute, you know, the leadership habits of Attila the Hun and so forth, but not very many that were short and readable and analytic. So I decided to write one. And that meant that I had to learn a little bit about leadership. And I had some fun doing it. I also wanted to take this concept of soft power that Corey mentioned, which I had originally developed in relation to international affairs, and relate it to leadership more generally. And perhaps the best way to explain this is to say that everything depends on context when you're studying either leadership or power. Think of leadership as a triangle. You have the leader, you have the followers, and you have the context in which they interact. And just to give you a little example of that, think of Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, many people say, was one of the great leaders of the 20th century. If you had looked at January 1940 and asked, was Winston Churchill a great leader, do you know what the answer was? No. He was regarded broadly as a failure. The conservative prime minister of Britain said, oh, there's Winston, but we never listened to him. By June of 1940, Churchill was the charismatic leader who saved Britain after Hitler's attack and the British driven off the French coast at Dunkirk. Churchill was the man who rallied the British people. By 1945, he was voted out of office. The British no longer concerned themselves about saving themselves from Hitler. They were concerned about developing a welfare state, and Churchill wasn't quite the right person for that. So if you ask, what is it that changed? It wasn't Winston Churchill's traits. They were the same in January of 1940, and they were the same in June of 1940. What changed was the context. The British people got fearful for their lives that they were about to be defeated by Hitler, and Churchill then became the man of the moment. His traits that seemed a bit wild, like a cowboy in January of 1940, became just what they wanted by June of 1940. So you always have to think, when you're talking about leadership, about context. And I'm going to come back to that at the end when I talk about context in American foreign policy. Power also depends on context. People sometimes think that power is having a lot of money or a lot of military equipment or whatever. In fact, if I have 10,000 tanks and you have 1,000 tanks, you're likely to think that I'm 10 times stronger than you. But if the battle is in a swamp, then those tanks may do no good at all, and I may not be 10 times stronger, as the Americans found out in Vietnam. If the battle's in the desert, yeah, terrific, 10 times, but in a swamp, not. So power resources always depend on context. What actually produces power? Now, what do I mean by power? Power is the ability to get the outcomes you want. The ability to affect others to get the things that you want is generally what we mean by power. That's defining it in terms of behavior. And there are three ways in which you can affect others to get what you want. You can threaten them with coercion. sticks. You can pay them with carrots, or you can attract them with honey. So carrot, sticks, and honey are three different forms of power. I call the first two, carrots and sticks, hard power, and I call the last one, that ability to get what you want by making others want it also, by attracting them, I call that soft power. Now, much of our traditional view of leadership, when we think about it, is based primarily on hard power. And if you look back, the traditional view could be traced in the 19th century to the Scottish political thinker Thomas Carlyle, in which he said in 1840, "Find the strongest, best man in any society, give him full reign, and there you have the makings of perfect government." This is sometimes called the big man theory of government. And it's even echoed today. Robert Kaplan, who writes for The Atlantic, talks about the need for a warrior ethic, and he calls it a pagan ethic. But if you think about that, you realize that most generals today are not like Achilles in the Odyssey, or the Iliad in the Odyssey, with swashbuckling swords and so forth. They're mostly using words, not swords. And smart warriors actually have to learn how to attract as well as compel. It's not just breaking bodies, it's also being able to win battles without breaking bodies that matters. So this view that the right way to lead is by command and control, and the big man theory really is not, I think, a very accurate form of thinking about leadership. Now, it's true there are lots of countries that are ruled that way. If you look at Zimbabwe, where Robert Mugabe is a dictator, I mean, that's the way he runs things. And there are probably more countries like that than there are like constitutional democracies. But on the other hand, it's not true that the only solution to leadership is sort of the big man theory. There's a psychologist called Arnold Ludwig, who's written an interesting book called King of the Mountain, in which he says, of course, it's in our genes that basically we and chimpanzees are closely related, 98% the same genetic structure. And therefore, if you look at chimpanzees, you'll find that every chimpanzee group has an alpha male. And that alpha male is the top dog for a while, and then he's replaced, and another alpha male replaces him, and so forth. And that form of leadership is inescapable because it's genetic. The trouble with that argument is that it doesn't really fit very well because when people try to find a leadership gene, they can't find it. You can do experiments with fraternal twins and identical twins and ask how many of them turned out to be leaders. And because fraternal twins and identical twins have different genetic makeups, you can get a fairly reasonable test. And what the evidence shows is that about a third of the difference of how people turn out as leaders is determined genetically, 2/3 of it not genetically. And another way of thinking about this is that if you take Ludwig's own views about, we're like chimpanzees and chimpanzees always have an alpha male, there is a group of chimpanzees, a smaller sized chimpanzees in the eastern Congo called bonobos. And the interesting thing about bonobos is that they're genetically virtually the same as the other chimpanzees, but they're female dominated. There are no alpha males. Essentially, they're basically they have a very loose leadership, and it tends to be more by the feminine than the masculine traits. So this argument to use sociobiology, in other words, that somehow it's all determined in our genes as to what's a leader or not, and that we have a big man leadership, I think is mistaken. In fact, you can even turn that around, and some people in leadership studies today are saying we should stand the big man theory of leadership on its head, and that what we are entering today is a woman's world of leadership. And the argument goes something like this, that in the information age where we are today, hierarchies are much flatter than they used to be. People are now connected with networks. It's not so much the command from the top down, as much as being in the center of a network and drawing people to you. So in that sense, it's not command power or hard power, it's attractive power that brings people to you that matters for success. And if you talk to leaders of a large multinational corporation with hundreds of thousands of employees spread around the world, they will tell you that you can't give orders to all these people. You have to get a vision, something others want to buy into. You have to attract people to this. So Sam Palmisano, for example, the CEO of IBM, says this old command and control, top-down view of leadership is devastating for companies. You have to have a much more flexible form of leadership than that. Now, if that's true, then basically what we're thinking about is something which in stereotypical terms has often been called women's style of leadership. In other words, when people do stereotypes, they say male leadership is command, control, macho, tough, give orders, and so forth. And women's style of leadership is attract, nurture, encourage participation, and these two stereotypes are usually set at odds with each other. And if that's true, and if it's also correct that the literature on leadership is saying you need to have more of this attractive capacity, more soft power, you could argue that we may be entering an era where women's stereotypical traits will be more suited to effective leadership than male stereotypical traits. The trouble with this argument, I think, is that it's a bad idea to think in terms of stereotypes, whether they're positive or negative. What we really are finding is that there are some women who have capacity to use soft power, but occasionally you're going to have to learn to act more like men, to use more hard power. And there's some men who traditionally in stereotypical terms use primarily hard power, but are going to have to learn to value their colleagues and to act more like their female colleagues if they're going to be effective leaders. And there's some social science work that's done by Alice Eagley at Northwestern and others, which have done studies to say, is it true that this style, this soft or participative style, is becoming more prevalent, more effective? The answer is yes. It's not either or, you need both, but the answer is that the new style is more important in a networked world. Well, if that's true, then we don't want to think about male or female types of leadership per se. We want to think in terms of hard power and soft power skills and figuring out how you combine them and under what circumstances. Let me give you a list of 6 critical skills. 3 of them are soft power skills, which have to be used by a man or a woman, and 2 of them are hard power skills, and the final one is contextual intelligence of how you combine these. Of the key soft power skills, the first one is emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence means the mastery of oneself and the ability to reach out to others. We're all familiar with IQ as we think about it in IQ tests. But IQ tests, as we understand them, really measure how good you are doing things that were felt to be important in the French school system of the 1890s. Mathematics, spatial relations, and so forth. And when psychologists have done studies and asked how much does being good on IQ tests predict success later in life, it turns out to be about 20%. There's another 80% that's not explained by IQ. And other psychologists have said part of that other 80% is emotional intelligence, your ability to master your emotions and relate them to others. And that is one of the key soft power skills for attracting people in terms of leadership. It sounds very fancy when you use a term like emotional intelligence. Let me give you an example, a historical example, to illustrate it. Chief Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, or Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was an old man. He'd fought in the Civil War. He was introduced to President Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s. And after this grand old figure met this American president, people asked him, what did you think of the president? And Holmes said, second-class intellect, but first-class temperament, which is another way of saying it's not IQ, it's emotional IQ that makes Franklin Roosevelt so successful. And in that sense, if you contrast that, let's say, with a president like Richard Nixon, who was very smart, thought his way through a lot of problems in foreign policy, but couldn't master the demons within him, his own emotions, and couldn't relate to others, you'll see why temperament may be more important for soft power skills than IQ, traditional IQ. The second key soft power skill is vision. And vision means presenting a picture of the future that gives meaning and inspires others. And this is what somebody like Hank Schacht, the former CEO of Lucent, would say, is that you have to have a vision in a large multinational corporation to get others to buy into what you're trying to do. You can't just tell people things. You want them to be attracted to what you see as the vision or the mission of this company. And if visions, you have to judge them by not just who can draw the prettier picture. Anybody can draw up a wish list. You have to ask, what's the balance between the inspiration in the vision and the realism of the vision? In other words, if you have a very inspiring vision, but it's unrealistic, and you wind up falling on your face, or your followers wind up falling on their faces, that's not very successful. There's a difference between a grand vision and a grandiose vision. Indeed, it's worth, for this illustration, to compare the two Bush presidencies. Bush 41, the father, was often tasked for not having a vision. And he himself used to say, I don't really like this vision thing. Bush 43, the current president, George W. Bush, has made a great point about having a vision of spreading democracy and freedom throughout the world. And the argument for invading Iraq was that when we created a democracy in Iraq, it would spread throughout the rest of the region. But that's a question then of whether the vision matched reality with inspiration. And in many terms, I think you could say that Bush 41, who had no vision, had a more successful foreign policy than Bush 43, who had a vision but wasn't able to implement it as effectively as his father did. So vision is important for attracting people to you, but a vision has to have a sense of balance between inspiration and reality. A third skill for exercising soft power is communications. And there we often think of the importance of rhetoric. Martin Luther King, if you listen to the cadences of Martin Luther King's speeches, if you've heard them replayed, he had a wonderful capacity to take the cadences of the African American church and make them reach out to people well beyond that, to the nation as a whole. Clearly a leader whose rhetoric and ability to communicate was tremendously important. Or to go back to Winston Churchill, Churchill often said that one of the things that he attributed his leadership to was his mastery of the English sentence. But it's also worth remembering that communications can be nonverbal as well as verbal. I don't know if any of you have ever seen any tapes or movies of Mahatma Gandhi speaking. Gandhi was a poor orator. He was not an inspiring orator. And what Gandhi did instead was communicate non-verbally. There are some pictures of Gandhi when he was a younger man, a British trained lawyer, dressed in a fancy suit and necktie and so forth. You contrast that with pictures of Gandhi as the leader of the Indian people seeking independence in the 1930s, where he has just this loincloth and peasant's cloak on. He was communicating non-verbally, not verbally, and was extremely effective that way. Or I'll give you another example, Lawrence of Arabia, T.E. Lawrence, who was an officer in the British military who helped the Arabs during the fight against Turkey during World War I. Lawrence showed up at the Paris Peace Conference in Versailles in 1919 wearing Arab robes. And everybody thought, this is bizarre, this is so flamboyant, a British army officer in Arab robes. He was trying to make a point that the Arabs were getting a bad deal out of this peace conference. 2 years later, when there was a meeting in Cairo, which was actually to delineate particular lines, he showed up in his proper British uniform. But that way, nonverbal communication is an extraordinarily important part of communication. But these three skills, emotional intelligence, the ability to project a vision, and the ability to communicate it, those are the skills that draw people, the soft power skills. They have to be combined with two other skills which are in the hard power category. One of those is what you might call organizational skills. And organization is particularly the management of information flows and reward systems. The greatest problem that many leaders have is the so-called emperor's clothes problem, where everybody was praising the emperor for having such a wonderful clothes until a little boy pointed out that he was naked. But none of his courtiers were willing to point out the truth. And that problem of how do you make sure that the information that is flowing to you and flowing away from you is accurately portrayed, that takes a tremendous amount of management skill. And some people are very good at this and others not. Bush 41, who I mentioned earlier, who I think had one of the best foreign policies that we've seen in the last 50 years, Bush 41 may not have had a vision, but he was a superb organizer. And he used General Scowcroft as his national security advisor to maintain order among a group of strong-willed people like Dick Cheney and others, Colin Powell, into an effective foreign policy team. His son, who had a great vision but was not particularly good at organization, had many of the same strong-willed personalities, was unable to forge them organizationally into an effective team. So organizational skills are another part of it. Then there's what you might call Machiavellian political skills. And that's the ability to size up other people's likes and dislikes, their strengths and weaknesses, and to figure out how to put together minimum winning coalitions so that you can get things accomplished. Sometimes people say, well, that's the politics of fear, and we don't want bullies. But occasionally, a bully can be successful if the bully accomplishes a combination of intimidation plus vision. Let me give you an example here. An easy example would be Bobby Knight, the basketball coach, but another example from that might be more intriguing would be Hyman Rickover. Hyman Rickover is often known as the father of the American nuclear navy. And Rickover built the American nuclear navy. Was Rickover a swashbuckling naval officer? No. He was near the bottom of his class at Annapolis. He was a small man. He was a man, however, who knew how to recruit resources from Congress and also knew how to have a clear vision of the mission of the nuclear navy, which is to be absolutely accident-free, tolerated no mistakes. What's interesting is that even though he was a difficult man to work for, that fact that he was a bully with a vision of a perfect nuclear navy, meant bright young officers wanted to come work for him. And he succeeded. So those two hard power skills, organizational and Machiavellian political skills, are important. But the key, to go back to where I started, is context, which is how do you put those together? When do you use your hard power skills? When do you use your soft power skills? And contextual intelligence means knowing how to combine hard and soft power into smart power, or a strategy that will succeed. And that means understanding culture, politics, your followers' needs, the urgency of time in some circumstances and not others, and the flows of information. And it's particularly important to be able to align your skills with the situation. Some people say, well, if you have a set of skills from practice or experience, that's all you need. But suppose it's a new situation. Do you have the contextual intelligence to adjust your skills for the new situation? Sometimes people make a distinction between might be called normal crises and extraordinary crises. A Category 3 hurricane in Florida is a normal crisis. It happens enough that we have all the preparations for how we deal with it. It does a lot of damage. It's not nice, but we have the procedures for how to deal with it. Katrina hitting New Orleans, where the levees are weak, that's not a normal crisis. And that ability to know when do you adjust your routines for new situations depends upon contextual intelligence. Or another example that's sometimes given is if you look at the World Trade Center and the September 11th, you ask, would you want people who knew a lot about going into high-rise towers on fire? In principle, yes. But if you said this is different because it's filled with jet fuel burning at a high rate of temperature, which is making these towers collapse, then the training which would have led you to, say, rush into the towers might have said, no, that's not the best response. So understanding context, essentially adjusting your bandwidth so that you can adjust to different situations, is the key to knowing how to combine your hard and soft power. This is best summed up perhaps by Mark Twain's anecdote about his cat. Mark Twain said that a cat that sits on a hot stove will not sit on a hot stove again, but it won't sit on a cold one either. And contextual intelligence means having the knowledge or the sense to know which stoves are hot and which stoves are cold. Now, if you finally, to summarize this and relate it to American foreign policy and America's position in the world, we as a people have not always been very good at understanding the global context of where we fit and what is American power. Sometimes we think we're too weak, sometimes we think we're too strong. You say too weak? Never. Well, in 1990, the conventional wisdom was the United States was in decline. Senator Tsongas, who was then running for president, ran for in New Hampshire, saying the Cold War is over and Japan has won. Paul Kennedy, my friend who teaches at Yale, wrote a book called The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers, saying the United States was finished. It made the bestseller lists. I wrote a book at the time that said, called Bound to Lead, that said the U.S. would be the leading country of the 21st century. I think I got the answer right, but he got all the royalties. But in any case, that was the conventional wisdom at the time. We didn't have a good sense of context of where the United States stood. And the net result of that was that we underestimated what we needed. By 2001, it was just the opposite. The Soviet Union was gone. We were the only superpower. And that led to a sort of triumphalism. The columnist Charles Krauthammer, who writes for the Washington Post and Time magazine, said it's a unipolar moment. The U.S. is in charge. We can do whatever we want, and others have no choice but to follow. And that, of course, has gotten us into pretty deep trouble over the last 6 or 7 years. So in that sense, understanding the context is extraordinarily important to understand power in the world and America's leadership role. As the biggest country, still have to play a major role, but we're not strong enough to do everything on our own. And we also have to realize that the contexts of power in the world today vary by the different types of resources. So I sometimes use the metaphor of a three-dimensional chessboard or chess game, where in the first top board you have military relations among states. And on that board, the United States is the only superpower, and it's probably going to stay that way for another couple of decades, regardless of what happens to China. On the middle board of economic relations among states, the world is already multipolar. We can't get what we want without cooperation from Europe, Japan, China, and others. And on the bottom board of this three-dimensional game of transnational relations, which cross borders outside the control of governments, things like climate change, pandemics, or transnational terrorism, this is chaotically organized. It makes no sense to call that unipolar or multipolar or any American empire or all the cliches that go with the top board. And the problem with this, of course, is that if you don't attract people to work with you, you're not going to be able to deal with these bottom board issues. In other words, you have to get groups of people who want to work with you to handle these types of problems. And in that sense, you're going to need more soft power. And over the last 5 or 6 years, we have essentially emphasized primarily our hard power and not paid enough attention to our soft power. The net result is we haven't had the cooperation that we need to deal with many of these problems. Another way of thinking about this is if you're playing three-dimensional chess and you play on one board only, in the long run you're going to lose. And the Americans have been playing primarily on this top board of military relations and not thinking enough about the other two boards. So what that means is we look ahead to the choice of a next president, the leader who will lead the leading nation in terms of size in the world. We need somebody who knows how to combine the soft power skills I described with the hard power skills, and who has enough sense of context internationally to know how to combine them under what circumstances for smart power strategies. That's not easy, but if we don't get that in the leaders of the next 4 and 8 years, we are going to, I think, pay a high price for it. So let me stop there with my thoughts about leadership in general and about leadership and America's role in the world, and throw it open for your questions, because from my point of view, I can hear myself talk anytime, but hearing you talk is much more interesting. So over to you. Yes?
Which candidate, in your opinion, best exemplifies the combination of the soft power and the hard power?
Well, it's interesting. If you take the two Democrats, Clinton and Obama, Hillary Clinton is almost more, tries to focus a little bit more on hard power. It's almost playing against type. For fearing that people won't trust having a woman president, she always stresses the hard power. Obama seems a bit more willing to do more with soft power, inspiration and so forth. So they go slightly against the stereotypes. McCain, who will be the Republican nominee, almost certainly, I think has been trained more in hard power. On the other hand, he has the good sense to realize that attracting others is important. If you look at the speech that he gave recently when he was in Europe, he spent a lot of time talking about the need to work with allies, the need to close Guantanamo, the need to avoid torture, things which help to restore American soft power. So each of them has different combinations of these skills. But probably, I think my own view is that we're fortunate to have 3 quite good candidates in the final 3. I mean, if we get to the Final 4 in basketball, we're lucky we have 4 good candidates. So we're in the Final 3 in politics, we've got 3 good candidates. Yes, in the back.
In like countries like Iran or North Korea, where it's mostly hard trades, would a soft approach work?
Well, yes and no, in the following sense that if you ask with North Korea, can you attract Kim Jong-il, the dictator, to give up his nuclear weapons? And the answer to that is no. You're going to have to rely very heavily on the hard power, primarily economic hard power of sanctions. And the country that has the most ability to sanction is China, not the U.S. We're all sanctioned out, so to speak. If you say, well, what about just bombing them? We have looked at that, and let me tell you, it's too expensive. In other words, if you look at the prospects of destroying his nuclear program, without his destroying Seoul and destroying the U.S.-South Korean alliance, that doesn't look too promising. So you're going to need to use a fair amount of hard power. But notice that in the context of doing that, you need to attract China and other countries to work with you. So your overall relationship with China matters. There's a diplomatic dimension to this in the so-called six-party talks. So soft power doesn't solve hard problems. I mean, there are many hard problems where you need hard power, but often is part of the mixture. It's often something that helps in the mixture, but in different degrees in different circumstances. I would say most of the mix with North Korea is hard. But if you go back to the Cold War, where the United States was very successful in combining hard and soft power, I mean, our ideas penetrated behind the Iron Curtain so that when the Berlin Wall finally came down It doesn't come down under artillery barrage. It came down under hammers and bulldozers, wielded by people who'd lost their faith in communism. So that's an example where dealing with a hard power country like the Soviet Union, soft power did work. Maybe in 30 years it would work with Kim Jong-il. I'm afraid in the short run it's going to be more hard power with North Korea. Yes?
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. My question concerns the qualities that you've identified, some of the characteristics that effective leadership involves, hard and soft power.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could please comment on the role of what might be described as political instinct or political intuition in dealing with leadership challenges, because one of the things that strikes me is that a number of prominent leaders have sometimes come through tough situations using their political instincts.
Mm-hmm.
President Reagan, or actually when he was candidate, Ronald Reagan, he went against the conventional wisdom on the Soviet Union and took the view that the Soviet Union was actually a power which could, if you like, buckle under competition. The view was the superpower, the Soviet Union was a pretty dynamic and awesome superpower. He sort of went across, cut under that view, and took the view that it wasn't such a strong power. And I suppose the events of the 80s, at least to his supporters, seemed to prove him right. George W. Bush, President Bush, he also talks about his gut instincts, his feelings about things. I wonder if you could comment on this. Perhaps it's covered by emotional intelligence, but I was just intrigued by how that fits into the picture.
Well, I would say that Ronald Reagan had quite good emotional intelligence. He had a good sense of self, good way to attract others, but he also had, I would argue, contextual intelligence. He had a good sense of what the larger world was like in big pictures. It's worth remembering, though, that Reagan, when he said, let's press the Soviets, he also knew when to back off. And what's most interesting is that the hardliners in his administration, he starts out, let's press very hard with the defense budget, spend them, and with strategic defense, we'll push them and so forth. But after he meets Gorbachev in Geneva in '85, he decides, I can work with this man. By the time they go to Reykjavik a year later, he's scandalizing his own hardline followers by saying, maybe we can do a deal to get rid of all nuclear weapons. And so Reagan basically wasn't, it's one thing to have an intuition saying, I will push hard. It's another to have an intuition of saying, when do I soften, when do I harden? When do I mix these two? He's surrounded by a lot of people who said, right on, boss, carry on that, push them over the cliff. Reagan didn't buy that. Reagan used his intuition to say, no, I'm going to do it my way. And that worked. On George W. Bush, I think his intuition was that, or he bought a vision, which is that you could solve the problem of terrorism by bringing democracy to the Middle East. And that as we brought democracy to the Middle East, even if we brought it at the barrel of a gun, that this would essentially spread and make different societies, which would mean there'd be no more roots for all this terrorism. That, I think, and then after we invaded Iraq, and it turned out that there wasn't this upwelling of democracy, that what we did is replace a tyranny of the minority, the Sunnis, with a tyranny of the majority, the Shia, and that you were getting a civil war between these two groups, with the Kurds standing off in the corner. He didn't adjust his thinking in a Reaganite way. In other words, he didn't have that flexibility, and I think George W. Bush is more like Woodrow Wilson than Ronald Reagan. He sees himself as Reagan's legatee, and indeed Carl Kennan has written a book about this recently, so it's very interesting. But he's more like Woodrow Wilson than like Reagan, extremely stubborn, and not adjusting in the same way that Reagan adjusted. So I think in that sense, intuitions or I would put it, contextual intelligence is very important. I think Reagan showed more contextual intelligence than Bush 43. Yes?
I'd like to know how you see the role of the program Voice of America.
Of Voice of America? Well, I think it's important to get our message out, But one of the paradoxes of what's called public diplomacy, of addressing not the other government but the people in the other country, one of the paradoxes of that is that the more they think it's propaganda, the less effective it is. So what's the United States, the extent to which we get Voice of America to represent government policy, it becomes less credible and people don't pay as much attention to it. So we've spent something like $150 million on setting up an Arabic television station called Al Hurra. And when you go to the Middle East and talk to people in friendly countries, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, they say nobody listens to it because it's regarded as, the voice of the American government, propaganda. If, on the other hand, you are self-critical and you allow voices to be broadcast which aren't necessarily, in quotes, on message, you gain credibility. So the BBC, which does that, is often more credible than American broadcasting. So we tend to think of the game of public diplomacy as if we can be slick in our advertising, we'll do really well. And we forget that the best advertising in the world can't sell a defective product. And the best public diplomacy, I think, is actually exchange programs and face-to-face relations. Edward R. Murrow, who was once the head of the U.S. Information Agency, called it the last 3 feet between you and another person face-to-face. And the reason that's important is it's two-way. You're listening as well as talking. The trouble with broadcasting is you're just broadcasting. You're not listening. And I think we would do better in public diplomacy if we spent a little less emphasis on broadcasting, and when we did broadcast, if we would make it more open and spent more effort on face-to-face relations. Yes?
It seems like with soft power, you have to have some sort of a give. You have to give with it. Because you have money. How do you use soft power in application to things like transnational terrorist groups and transnational organized crime groups, where the general thought, the ethical thought is you don't negotiate with terrorists. There is no give. So how do you apply it to contexts where they aren't viewed as a legitimate source of a giving?
Well, I don't think you can use soft power to attract Osama bin Laden or hardcore terrorists. I think you have to use hard power. You have to catch them and kill them or deter them. But if you think about the important question of dealing with terrorism is not, is it going to catch bin Laden with honey, but what about the people that follow bin Laden? What about their capacity to recruit? And if you think of the great majority of Muslims, the mainstream Muslims are not interested in killing innocents and women and children and so forth. And the extent to which we want to win this in the long run depends upon our ability to attract that group. That's where the soft power comes in. Donald Rumsfeld, when he was Secretary of Defense, said that, how would you know if you're winning a war on terrorism? And he said the key will be whether the numbers that you're killing and deterring is greater than the numbers that they're recruiting. Now, what British and American intelligence both concluded was that the Iraq War helped bin Laden to recruit more terrorists than we were killing and deterring. That's a case in which our actions, the way we used our hard power, actually helped him. And what we have to do is think of how can we appeal to mainstream Muslims so that we dry up that source of recruits for him. So hard power, yes, you need it against bin Laden, but soft power you need for that mainstream. And that's the only solution to Rumsfeld's metric, as he put it. Yes?
Given the importance of future of leaders' ability to adjust within context, how do you see our role as encouraging those characteristics in others and also becoming those leaders that are going to be able to adjust contextually in the future?
Well, I think the most important thing to teach when you're teaching leadership is to make sure people understand the different cultures, the different power distributions, the different contexts that they're going to get into. Very often you'll see somebody who's a great business leader who'll go to Washington and fall on his face as a cabinet minister, or you'll see somebody who is a good cabinet minister or secretary of a department in Washington who will then go to a university to be president and fall on his face. They haven't adjusted to the different culture and political distribution. So what we want to do in training leaders is essentially to broaden their bandwidth, to get them a broader repertory so that they can then know how you tune within that. And that's why I put this stress on contextual intelligence. Because in the world today, you're going to find that most of you are going to be doing different jobs at different times of your life. Some of you will be in the nonprofit sector, some of you in the private sector, some in government, but not always for all your life. You're likely to switch back and forth between different sectors, different jobs. And if you don't develop a broad contextual intelligence, you don't develop a broad bandwidth, you won't have that ability to tune as you change situations. That's essentially the argument for contextual intelligence. Yeah, on the back. It's both. I mean, if you look at how much can leadership be taught or how much is innate, it's a bit of each. The Army has a phrase in which they say training leaders is be, know, do. Be means you have to ask who you are, how do you understand yourself. Know means to develop a set of skills. Do means to practice them and to learn from the practice. And I think that combination, the second of those, the know part, and some of the be part you can do in school, but a large part of it is do, the experience, and the after-action reviews which you allow to correct for your mistakes. So I think it's both. Yeah. One more question? Yes.
Given what you said about contextual intelligence and the fact that we have 3 senators running for president, what do you see as necessary then to develop a contextual intelligence to move from a Senate type of organization, committees and whatnot, to a more hierarchical presidential candidate? And is there somewhat of an equifinality, like you say in your book, in their skills? Like, are all 3 going to be capable to do that? Or
Well, no, it's a very good question because it's been decades since we've had a situation like this where we're guaranteed a senator for the next president. I think, wasn't it Jack Kennedy was the last directly elected from Senate? I mean, Lyndon Johnson was a senator, but through the vice presidency. And that's going to be interesting. I mean, if John McCain obviously knows something about military command, but it's still a pilot is not the same thing as running a unit. And, you know, he has certain skills, but will have to broaden them. For example, as he deals with the economy and so forth. Hillary Clinton has not run things much larger than a Senate staff, except a campaign, which is about 700 people or so. But she has had, as she argues, some osmosis, I mean, being next to somebody who's doing these things, presumably some of it rubs off. Barack Obama has neither of those, but he has a different type of skill, which is rare in American presidents or candidates for president. Here is a man who has a family in Africa and who grew up running around rice paddies in Indonesia, which gives him a much broader view of the world, a very different type of experience, but again has led nothing larger than a Senate staff. So each of these people, if they become president, is going to have to be alert to the fact that they haven't run something larger and surround themselves with people who can help them as they move in that direction. Anyway, it's good to have a chance to chat with you all, and good luck as you become leaders.